Hi, in this session, I'm going to talk to you about research designs. There are many ways to do marketing research. The path we decide to use for doing research is called research design. In this session, I'll talk to you about research designs in general and the various types of research designs. And then I'll focus specifically on exploratory research designs. In the research pipeline, we have the various steps. Research design is examined after one has formulated the problem and figured out the approach to the problem. The second step of the research process is a blueprint for research study. It is a guiding framework for all the things that happen hereafter. It informs decisions about the nature of data to be collected, how the data is to be gathered, the sample from which data is to be gathered, and how it is to be analyzed. There are three research designs that are commonly used. An exploratory research design is utilized when one has very little structure about the problem. When we have a rough idea about what the research problem is, or we feel less confident about the research problem formulated, one would look at an exploratory research design. A descriptive research design is utilized when the problem is better structured. For instance, a marketer is interested in comparing 2 or 3 segments on clearly defined categories. Or a researcher is interested in examining which of 4 or 5 attributes have an effect on a person's intention to buy a product. In all these cases, one would conduct a descriptive research design. A causal research design is used when problem is very clearly defined. Specifically, when one is looking for a cause and effect relationship, a causal research design is called for. Imagine a researcher is interested in figuring out which of 3 ads to use in a Google search ad. A researcher may have 3 different titles figured out and isn't sure which one to go with. In this case, she could conduct a causal research design to compare the 3 designs on some criteria like click-through rate or number of actions or behaviors completed. The order of the research designs to be followed isn't exactly linear. Often people think about there being a linear path from exploratory to descriptive to causal. But in a research process, one doesn't have to conduct or examine all 3 research designs. One might make a choice to go with just one of 3 research designs and be done with it. If the problem is very clearly structured, one would choose a causal research design, and that would be that. In other cases, one might begin with exploratory, jump to causal, and then decide that maybe some more information is sought after that is best suited to a descriptive research design. Bottom line, the various research designs may be used in a nonlinear sort of iterative fashion. Exploratory research design is used when the problem is loosely structured, when one is still at the hypothesis development stage or hypothesis clarifying stage. And I'll talk much more about this in the following slides. Descriptive research designs are utilized when one wants to, let's say, compare segment characteristics, or compare 3 sets of people, or examine the drivers of buying behavior. This is typically, a descriptive research typically involves doing some form of a survey. This might be a longitudinal study, which involves gathering data from people over a span of time, or gathering data from the same set of people via a survey over a span of time. A great example of panel design would be a Simmons panel, where Simmons gathers consumer demographic and attitudinal behavioral data over a span of time. Typically, every 6 months, a panelist is asked to fill out a long survey, and this panel, by its very nature, one expects the panel to remain fairly consistent over time. Of course, there's going to be some attrition, but in an ideal world, the panel would have the same sample over a reasonable period of time. A sample survey is when a person typically does a cross-sectional study, asking people a set of questions about an issue of interest. Bottom line, with descriptive research, one utilizes a survey. When the goal is to identify a direct cause-effect relationship, one conducts an experiment. The hallmark of a causal research design is then an experiment, which could be conducted in a controlled environment called lab experiment, or in an uncontrolled, practical, real environment called a field experiment. Let's drill down into exploratory research. At the early stage of the research process, the problem is usually loosely structured, or even if it is better, clearly structured, one may not be entirely confident about the way the problem has been described or defined. In such scenarios, the researcher might decide to probe, to explore, to refine the problem. In other cases, the problem might be too large, and it may be helpful then to break a large problem into specific components or hypotheses. These hypotheses may then in turn help guide a descriptive research design or help decide what analysis techniques to use in the analysis stage. Exploratory research is characterized by flexibility, the ability to pivot, change direction, to drill down, to go in directions that are interesting, and to abandon tangents if they're not interesting, or abandon the decided path, the previously chosen path, if it doesn't seem to be yielding benefits. So flexibility is a hallmark of exploratory research. Oftentimes, the insights gleaned from exploratory research might be beneficial in figuring out the nature of descriptive or causal research designs. Thus, many would say one must first conduct exploratory research and followed up with descriptive and then causal research designs. But as I noted before, it doesn't have to be this exact format, but indeed, that tends to be common. The common choice tends to be exploratory first, followed by descriptive, and then causal. The question that's frequently asked is exploratory research qualitative? It's not a trivial question because, indeed, many exploratory research methods tend to be qualitative. It doesn't have to be that way, but there is a strong correlation, let's say. Many techniques that are exploratory tend to be qualitative. So it is fair then to say that exploratory research is qualitative. Of course, you might wonder, well, what is qualitative and what is quantitative? As the label suggests, with quantitative research, one seeks to quantify, assign a number to the data gathered. While with qualitative, one is seeking a general understanding of the underlying reasons and motivations for consumer behavior. Because of its nature, qualitative research, which involves drilling down, learning in depth, and being flexible, for these reasons, the sample of respondents tends to be small and often not representative of the population at hand. The data gathering, data collection process is often unstructured. The analysis is often non-statistical, but it doesn't have to be. There are ways of analyzing qualitative data in a quantitative manner, but indeed, in most cases, you'd see the analysis as being non-statistical, non-quantitative. Ultimately, qualitative research will help develop an initial understanding of the problem. It may not offer a solution to the problem. Quantitative research tends to have a large sample, have a clearly defined structure, for example, a predefined survey with predefined questions shared with a large sample of respondents. The analysis is often statistical, and the ultimate result might be a clear takeaway of what should be done. Qualitative research can be categorized as being direct or indirect. The direct or undisguised research options include focus group and depth interviews. Indirect or disguised approaches include projective techniques, observation methods, and ethnography. I'm going to drill down into each one of these now. Let's begin by examining the direct methods. By their very name, it tells you something. Direct methods involve asking questions directly of the respondent. With indirect, we find ways of learning about the consumer without we learn more about the consumer by not asking the question directly, and therefore indirect or disguise. And again, more about that in a little bit. Let's jump in and take a look at the first direct or undisguised technique, projective technique. So, first qualitative research technique. So with focus group interviews, you typically place a group of people in a room and have them discuss an issue of interest. The conversations are typically recorded and the body language observed by video. To keep the conversation on track, frequently a moderator is used. The job of the moderator is to guide the conversation around the subject of interest. The moderator's job is very important because it is important the moderator not bias the opinions of any respondents, but merely encourage more conversation around the subject of interest. The sample of people participating in a focus group interview is typically small. An interview as such might last anywhere from 30 minutes to about 2 hours. It's typically conducted in an observation room like the one you're witnessing on your screen. The role of the moderator is extremely important in guiding the conversation, and here's some of the things that a moderator needs to be good at doing. Moving along, a focus group interview can yield some very interesting insights. Here's one. BMW was interested in learning more about what instrument panel noises would make consumers feel like they are BMW sounds. It's a very loosely structured question. It's a lot to do with perception. So BMW conducted a focus group interview then and had interview participants listen to various instrument panel warning sounds. They had 25 of them to learn to gain feedback from respondents on. And ultimately, they zeroed in on one that they felt was most symbolic of a BMW. In another study, a Japanese motorcycle manufacturer was curious to understand why their brands of motorcycles weren't selling despite being well engineered. So they decided to ask the respondent or ask the customer. They got a couple of consumers in a room and had them discuss what excites them about motorcycles. What they learned from the interviews was that all the focus group interviewees believed this motorcycle brand had excellent engineering. There were no complaints about the quality of workmanship of the motorcycles. But it turns out that's not what they woke up in the morning to get excited about. What they really cared about in a motorcycle was something more more deeper. They bought a motorcycle as a way to express themselves. To them, a motorcycle meant freedom, getting away. It meant some sort of an emancipation for the consumers. They weren't buying a motorcycle for its reliability. They were buying it for a ticket to another world. Consequently, based on this research, the motorcycle brand, knowing fully well their motorcycles are well engineered, but they realized that what people really cared about was the sense of freedom. So they decided to position the motorcycle on the notion of freedom rather than on good engineering. These are the kinds of qualitative insights that emerge typically from a focus group interview. There are, of course, over time, there are many variations available of focus group interviews. And as time has gone along, we've learned that it's cost effective to conduct focus group interviews in a web mediated environment. So we've seen a lot of these online focus groups emerging over time. Interviews, or what are also called depth interviews, are another qualitative technique that is commonly used. With interviews, the goal here is to have a conversation with a participant in a one-on-one environment. So the researcher has, literally a conversation with the participant, maybe in a room or in a mall, which would then be a mall interview. The format can be anywhere from structured to general. It can vary from being loosely structured to being flexible. It's very, an interview is designed to yield insights that are hard to glean from a structured survey. An interview is designed to be able to go off on interesting tangents as the conversation goes along with the interviewer. For these reasons, the role of the interviewer is extremely important to determine the success of a depth interview. Now, I've been saying depth interview every now and then. You might wonder, why do I say depth interview as opposed to interview? What's the difference? Well, people call a depth interview simply because it has, with an interview, one has a conversation with a customer, but with a depth interview, one has the ability to pursue a certain interesting tangent or interesting direction. So that's what makes it a depth interview. For instance, a researcher might pick up on a certain topic and just ladder in to that topic. Let's see more about the laddering technique then to better understand why we call this a depth interview as opposed to just interview technique. So here's an example of laddering. A conversation might go in a form like this, where the researcher might ask the question, why do you recycle? Customer says, reduce waste. The follow-up question then is, why is that important? Respondent goes, to keep the environment clean. And why is that important? To save the planet for future generations. So now we've understood the deeper reason for recycling is to save the planet. So any advertising then should highlight saving the planet part. Right? And that's what can be learned by these depth interviews, laddering being one example of a depth interview. There are, of course, other kinds of depth interviews also. One of them is the hidden issue questioning, which tries to get at deeper issues that might affect how somebody feels about a product or brand. There's also symbolic analysis. That is another kind of depth interview technique. Moving along, I'm going to go into now projective techniques, but I'll save that for the next video, right?